Scripture reading this evening will be from Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. Again, that's Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27. And when he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he was asleep. And they went and woke him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. And he said to them, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?
Good evening. One thing I did want to mention that I neglected to last week was I've had the privilege, as all of us have shared in the privilege over the last couple months, of seeing Zach and Trevor and Bryce give 3 really good lessons. And something that I hear a lot as you visit other congregations, and something that a lot of us hear as we visit other congregations, is one thing that a lot of people worry about is the next generation. What's the next generation going to be? And that's something that so many churches are afraid of now. And as I heard those sermons from those 3 men, and not only that, but hearing really good invitations from Kyle on a consistent basis, and I know that the elders here have peace of mind knowing that the next generation is looking very, very bright. But it's not even just from a teaching aspect. There's ways that men have contributed besides that through in this congregation. And I know Justin, he comes in on his days off and he's working on landscaping out in the front of the building. And I just wanted to express how encouraging that is to me to see that, and how much I look up to you guys for that. And I really appreciate that. But notwithstanding, the sermon is titled this evening, Why Are You Fearful? And it comes from a direct quote of Jesus Christ, as we just read in Matthew chapter 8, 23 through 27. And what we see here as far as context is Jesus Christ and his disciples get into a boat to cross the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus falls asleep as he'd been working hard, ministering and dealing with large crowds of people that day leading up to them getting on the boat. And he falls asleep on the boat, and while he's asleep, a great storm comes about, and it starts tossing the boat back and forth. And the boat begins to take on water. And it's at this point in Matthew chapter 8 and in 25 that he's woken up by his disciples. And they say, Lord, save us. We are perishing. And then he replies to them, Why are you fearful, you of little faith? Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So men marveled, saying, Who can this be, that even the winds and the sea obey him? Of course, we're all impressed by that, the fact that Jesus just gets up and he rebukes the winds and the waves. But what I want to focus on more specifically is that question and that remark that he makes to his disciples when he says, Why are you fearful? Followed by, O you of little faith. And what we're going to find is that this is a specific type of fear that we're dealing with here. And we see that the disciples, that they are fearing to the point of panic, where they're worried about what is going to happen to them, despite the fact that their Lord Jesus Christ is in the boat with them. And what we find as we study the Bible is that there's really a couple different words that are used to translate the word fear, or afraid, as some translations put it. One is phobos, which is really just a phobia. It's a typical fear. You might have a fear of heights, or if you're about to go into a burning building, there's a natural fear that takes place there. But that's not what Jesus is referring to here when he says, Why are you fearful, O you of little faith? The word that he's using there is found only 3 times in the New Testament, and it's the word delos. And of course, it's found here in this Matthew account. It's also found in the same circumstance of Mark's account of what's going on here in Mark chapter 4 and in verse 40. But you may be surprised to find out that it's found in another verse that a lot of us are familiar with, and that's Revelations chapter 21 and in verse 8. In Revelations chapter 21 and verse 8, it gives us insight into what that word exactly means and what kind of fear we're dealing with here. Revelations 21:8 says, "But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. But pay attention to what that first couple words were. But the cowardly and unbelieving. Cowardly, that's Delos. And so we see in the Mark account and the Matthew account that this Delos fear is not just a typical fear, but it's one that is associated with disbelief, with unfaithfulness. It's not one that exists along with faith. It can't exist along with faith. It comes along, this Delos fear, it comes along and it diminishes our faith and replaces it. And so that's what we're dealing with this evening. I'm not trying to preach here this evening and tell you to never be afraid, because there's a natural fear that we all encounter on a day-to-day basis. It's an emotion that God has given us. But this Delos fear is a different level. And we're talking about something different here. Of course, we see great men of the Bible who are in fearful situations and are in situations that are stressful, but they have great faith that gets them through that. David and Goliath comes to mind. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, here you have David, who is just a youth, and there's Goliath, who's proposing this challenge. And there's nobody that's rising up to the occasion, but here comes David, who says, I can do it. And in 1 Samuel chapter 17, and we'll start in verse 36, we see David and why it is exactly that he has that courage. In verse 36, he says, your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And so right away, something that sticks out to me is David is reflecting on past experiences that he's had. And he said, you know what? I've had encounters with a bear, and I've had encounters with a lion, and the Lord delivered me each time. And this time is going to be no different. And we can learn something from that, can't we? Looking at our past experiences and seeing how on earth is this going to work out. And we use the term that problems aren't going to take care of themselves. We say that. But so many times in our lives, it almost seems like they do. Sometimes if we just remain faithful and we look at these insurmountable odds that are against us, and somehow, some way, we manage to get through that. And we all need to be like David and reflecting on our past and seeing the times when God has delivered us, and use that confidence and that faith in God to build up in us so that we can face the next challenge that is ahead of us. And of course, we see David having this conversation if you drop down to verse 47. And you got that famous line from David when he says, then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with the sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And so you see David with that famous line saying that the battle belongs to the Lord. And that's where he gets his courage, with his faith in God, that God is going to take care of this, even though he's facing a giant and he's just a kid. But what about Jesus Christ himself? In the garden, but when he's getting ready to die and he knows the fate that is waiting for him. If you turn over to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew 26, we see Jesus having this conversation. And before he goes into prayer, it says in verse 38 of chapter 26. Then he said to them, my soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me. So right away you see that there is some stress that's going on with Jesus. But what does he do? He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, oh, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. And we can all understand that. But pay attention to what he says following that. He says, not as I will, but as you will. And then he goes and we see that he sees his apostles falling asleep in that conversation. But again, he goes to pray a second time. And again he says, oh, my Father, in verse 42. He says, oh, my Father, if this cup cannot pass away from me unless I drink it, your will be done. Jesus had faith in God, and he wasn't going to allow this circumstance to shake him. And I reflect on a conversation I had with an individual once where they told me, you know what? It was easy for God to die on the cross because he loved us so much. And I said, well, one thing's true. Jesus did love us a lot, but there was nothing easy about that situation that took place on that cross, which makes it all the more important, which makes it all the more impressive, his courage, that is. And I would encourage anybody who thinks that it was easy to also look at the Luke account of the same exact prayer that's going on for Jesus in the garden. And in Luke 22, in verse 42, Jesus is praying, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him. And even though that angel came and strengthened him, look what it says in verse 44. It says, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. There was nothing that was emotionally easy for Jesus going into that. But his faith was in God. And we need to all be thankful for that, don't we? That Jesus Christ wasn't overcome with a day-loss fear that caused him to run out of that garden and sprint away from being nailed to the cross. But that he said, Father, your will be done. And he went through with his Father's plan, didn't he? His will was done. And so we go back to the question that he asked his disciples on the boat. Why are you fearful? And we need to ask ourselves, why are we fearful? And so that's what we're going to be dealing with this evening. Why are we fearful? And the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go through a list of fears that are common for all of us, a list of things that many of us struggle with as far as fear goes. But I'm going to give you a spoiler right now. The answer is Jesus Christ. The answer is God, every single time. And we're going to see that pattern as we go through a list of these fears that we all come across in our lives. And so, why are we fearful? Maybe we fear failure. We fear failure, prospective failure. We fear being described as a failure, that adjective. Because we've all failed before, haven't we? And you think about sin, which is man's ultimate failure. Sin is man's ultimate failure. It's the only failure that can condemn you eternally. And yet that sometimes is the least of our fears, is sin. We worry about everyday things constantly. We get wrapped up in our own little world and we start to believe that it's everything. And we develop these fears for providing for ourselves or our family, or fear of not finding a respectable job, or fear of failing a school exam, or fear of not living up to yours or others' expectations. We're constantly battling with this fear of failure. But we can't allow it to overcome us to the extent where it diminishes our faith. We can't allow that fear to become so great. We can't allow it to become a day-loss fear. We need to turn to God. And if we're thinking about failures, I want to impress upon you tonight that Christians are not failures. That is not a word that describes a Christian. If you would turn over to John 16:33. And if you want with your finger to mark your finger at 1 John 5 and verse 4-5, because we're going to see a correlation going on here between John 16:33 and 1 John 5 and verse 4 and 5. Jesus says in John 16:33, it says, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer. I have overcome the world." What does that mean? Jesus Christ, he lived a life and he overcame our sin, our ultimate failure that condemns us eternally. But now if we turn over to 1 John chapter 5, in verse 4 and 5, we see just how important and how valuable and how meaningful that can be. In 1 John 5 and verse 4 and 5, John says, "For whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Who is he who overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God?" Do we see the correlation that's going on there? Being a failure, that's not a word that describes a Christian, because we have Jesus who overcame the world for us. So what are we when we believe in God, when we're born of God, and we live a faithful life dedicated to God? We're not failures. We're overcomers. I don't know if that's a word or not, but I like it, so I'm going to go with it. We're not failures. Because Christ has overcome the world, and when we believe in God, we too can overcome the world. The only time that we fail is when we walk in sin or we give up on the faith. And that's it. So if you have a fear of failure, the answer is be born of God and be faithful to God, and you'll overcome the world. Of course, if it's not one thing, then it's another thing. Maybe the fear of disappointment. We say, oh, sure, we've overcome the world, but I'm just disappointed. There's a lot of things that disappoint us in this life. Maybe it's we're disappointed by a certain outcome that we don't like. We wanted something to turn out one way and it turned out another, and so we're really disappointed. It's disappointed by things that we have no control over a lot of times. Or maybe we're in a circumstance that's really disappointing to us, a difficult circumstance that life has put us in, and we're disappointed by it. And of course, the big one, disappointed by people who have let us down. We have all been in that situation where we're counting on somebody and they just let you down in a big way. Or maybe even we've been the ones who have done that before. But that's why we aren't supposed to put our trust in circumstances or in possible outcomes or in people. If you turn over to Isaiah 40 and 31, what does the prophet Isaiah say? In verse 31, he says, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." Don't put your hope in possible circumstances that may or may not happen. Don't put your hope in possible outcomes. Hope in God, and He will strengthen you. And we certainly don't put our hope in individuals, as the psalmist says in Psalms 146. 146 in verse 3 says, "Do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son of man, in whom there is no help. His spirit departs, he returns to his earth, and that very day his plans perish. Happy is he who has the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God, who made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, who keeps truth forever, who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry. The Lord gives freedom to the prisoners." Don't hope in princes. Don't hope in man. We put our hope in God, and we turn to Him for help, ultimately. And what exactly does that look like, turning to God for help? Philippians 4, verse 6 and 7, Paul tells us what it looks like to turn to God for help. When Paul says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ." And so we look at this fear that we have of being disappointed. But if we just trust in God, trust in the one who is perfect, we will never be disappointed. There may be situations where others disappoint us in this life, but if we turn to God, that disappointment isn't going to overcome us, because God, we can count on Him, unlike any other person or thing in this life. He can protect you from your fear of disappointment. He can even protect you from fear of disappointment and death. Even in death, God can protect you from that fear. There's so many people that suffer from a fear of death. There's so many people that don't have the privilege of being a Christian. There's so many people that fear what's going to happen to themselves or to loved ones, and or what exactly is going on the other side of death and what that looks like. And they fail to acknowledge or realize the fact that the very reason that Jesus Christ lived and died for us was to fear us from the fear of death, to free us from the fear of death. In Hebrews 2 and verse 14 and 15, Hebrew writer says, "Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage." Thanks be to Jesus Christ that we don't have to be afraid of death. In fact, he takes this fear of death that we have, and what he does is he really turns it into hope. The hope that says that this life isn't it, that there's more to life than this. In 1 Thessalonians 4 and 13, chapter 4, 13 and 14, it says, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus." Jesus Christ, living and dying on the cross, he showed us not only how to live, but he showed us how to die. And he takes that fear and he turns it into hope. Because I remember as a kid, as a young teenager, the reason that I first got baptized is I woke up one morning and I was afraid what was going to happen to me when I died. And I realized it was time to get baptized. And I remember feeling so amazing when I had been baptized because I no longer had to be afraid of death, but that I had a hope given to me because of Jesus Christ and because of the baptism that I had just gone into, because I confessed my sins, because I repented. We don't have to worry about that fear. Jesus Christ has taken care of our eternal future. But what about even more simpler than that? Some of us aren't even worried about our eternal future. The thing that we worry most about, the thing that we fear most, is our immediate future. What's going to happen tomorrow, next month? How is a problem going to be fixed? How will my life turn out? Will I have a family, be happy, live a long life, get a good job, etc., etc.? But over in Matthew chapter 6, 25 through 34, he's dealing with a group of people who too are worried about their future and where certain things are going to come from. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus, in verse 25, Jesus says, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing?" And he tells them to observe the birds of the air and how God takes care of the birds. And are we not of more value than the birds of the air? And then in verse 28, he addresses this issue of worrying about what we're going to wear. And he says, "So why do you worry about clothing? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. And yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Now if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he not much more clothe you?" Now pay attention to what he says right here. "O you of little faith? Therefore do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For after all these things the Gentiles seek. For your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." So what is it that we're worried about with our future? Again, do we worry about the job that we're going to get or the level of success that we're going to experience or how much money we're going to make. Look at what Jesus is dealing with right here. He's dealing with a group of people that are simply worried about what they're going to eat and what they're going to drink and what they're going to wear. I mean, really, if you boil down life, it comes down to two things. It comes down to survival and comfort. Survival, where are we going to get our meal? Comfort, where are we going to sleep? What are we going to wear? And God tells them that that God will take care of those things. And these are things that they were searching for, wondering where they're going to come from. And all the while, these are things that we all have in such great excess. We go to the store and we can get anything to eat. Even if we're running low on money, there's welfare and food stamps and things that take care of that. And comfort, we all go home to warm houses and a comfy bed and nice blankets. We open up our closets, and it's kind of sad how many articles of clothing I have in my closet. Like, I don't even need most of it. And these people were worried about what they're going to eat and what they're going to drink. And then we find all these other things that we worry about. And it causes this fear, this unnecessary fear that overcomes us and takes our focus away from what it should be on, which is God. Maybe the problem is we need to be a more simple and peaceful individuals. Maybe we need to stop looking for things that we don't need and just focus on what God has already blessed us with, instead of constantly raising expectations and wanting more. I think we can learn a lot from Paul in Philippians 4. In Philippians 4 in verse 11 through 13. Paul says, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am, to be content. I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Paul found himself in a various amount of circumstances. He found himself in all sorts of different circumstances in life, where he had a lot and he had a little, where he was facing death and where he was safe. And yet, it didn't matter what circumstance he was in. He made the decision that he's going to be content. And the way that he did that, and he acknowledges it in verse 13, he says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." So you fear what the future holds? The answer is Christ. It's God. We look at all these things. We look at the fear of failure. And what is the answer? It's God. We look at the fear of disappointment. And what is the answer? God. We look at the fear of death. And what's the answer? God. We fear what the future holds. And what's the answer? It's God. It's God every single time. Because God is the answer to our fears. And so we look at this, and going back to this day-loss fear, this fear that is so great that it diminishes faith and doesn't allow faith in God to exist. It's a cowardly or timid spirit. And we look at, really, we have two options, don't we? And we realize this, a decision needs to be made. We have fear, or we have faith. Because what is faith? Hebrews 11:1 tells us what faith is. It says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." And if you think about it, faith is really the opposite of what fear is. Because where does fear come from? It comes from our minds and unknown outcomes, or we look at the worst possible outcome that there is, and we say that's what's going to happen, and so it causes this great fear. And then all of a sudden, we find ourselves discouraged, and we're not trusting in God anymore, but rather we're just constantly trying to solve this problem that's in our life. And we're trying to avoid something from happening that may or may not even happen at all. So what are we going to choose? Are we going to choose faith in God and hope? Or are we going to choose fear? We see too many times examples of people in the Bible showing us that we can do it, showing us that faith can diminish fear, this day-loss fear. We don't want this day-loss fear to diminish our faith, but rather we want our faith to diminish this day-loss fear. A couple examples that come to mind. Well, first of all is from our text, Jesus Christ, in Matthew 8:24. And what is the circumstance that's going on there? You have this storm that's tossing this boat back and forth, and the boat is starting to take on water. And everybody on the boat is freaking out, saying that they're going to die, worried about perishing. But here's Jesus Christ, and what's he doing? He's asleep. And I don't want to assume too much, but I almost kind of picture Jesus being asleep there and kind of opening one eye and going back to sleep until his disciples go and wake him up. Because the fact remains that everybody else was awake and freaking out, but Jesus Christ was sitting there asleep. I would attribute that to his faith. And it's telling what faith can do. It's also telling of what fear can do. If you have as great a faith as Jesus, you can find that you can sleep peacefully in whatever circumstance life puts you in, whatever challenges life gives you. But if it's fear, then we find ourselves tossing and turning, don't we? And panicking, just like how the disciples were panicking on that boat. Our faith has to diminish our fear. What about Joshua and Caleb? In Numbers 14 and verse 24, God says that Caleb had a different spirit. And in Numbers 13 and verse 30, we see this scenario leading up to this verse where the spies were to go into the land of Canaan and spy out the land and to see what it was like and to see if they could overcome the enemies who were already dwelling in that land. And all the spies that come back except for Joshua and Caleb are freaking out, saying that we can't do it. We can't overcome the people who are dwelling there. What does Caleb say in Numbers 13 verse 30? He says, "Let us go up at once and take possession, for we are able to overcome it." And then in Numbers 14, we see, again, the confidence that Caleb and Joshua have in God. As you see, all the people of Israel are panicking, are freaking out. They're saying ridiculous things like, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Or if only we had died in this wilderness. Which is funny that their answer to not dying is that they wish they would have just died beforehand. Doesn't make sense. And so everybody's panicking. Then you get to Joshua and Caleb in verse 6 of Numbers 14, and it says, "Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes. And they spoke to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, 'The land we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, nor fear the people of the land, for they are our bread. Their protection has departed from them, and the Lord is with us.'" And he says, "Do not fear them." Because all of Israel was overcome with this day-loss fear, this fear that took away from their faith in God. And it condemns them, doesn't it? It keeps them from entering into the land of Canaan. But there's two exceptions to that: Joshua and Caleb. They got to go into the land of Canaan. And why is that? Because they didn't have this day-loss fear. They had this trust in God, this unwavering faith in God, that God was the answer to their fears and that he was going to deliver them, as he had already done so many times on their way to the promised land. Of course, we also think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the situation there in Daniel 3 and in 16 where Nebuchadnezzar is telling them, you're going to bow down to my gods or else I'm going to throw you into this fiery furnace. And their response in Daniel 3:16 is, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. He is able to deliver us. I'm telling you, that's the faith that God is looking for. It's a faith that he has the power to do anything. God wants us to have the faith that he has the power to give us victory, that he has the power to comfort us, that he has the power to save us from death, that he has the power to take care of tomorrow. Rest assured, God has the power to do anything. And so I would just want to close with a question. Do you choose to have faith? Do we choose to have faith in God's power? Or are we going to choose fear? I hope that we would choose faith. I hope that we do choose faith going forward. If there are any here this evening who have been studying the Word of God and they realize that they need to make the decision to be baptized, maybe you're like me. Maybe you fear what's going to happen to you when you die. Christ lived and died to fear us from that death. And it starts with baptism. Or if you find yourself getting off the path and you want to get back on the straight and narrow, or any spiritual need, come forward while we stand and sing the song of invitation.